you didn't see it.
Okay. How's it going? Says 10:20. It says it's my time. Yeah. That's like what do you think I can start screaming? I should see the screen. You think they listen to me? It's just like, oh, there he goes again. One guy just walks away. He's like, oh, whatever. Awesome. Kids are so lucky these days. How lucky was that? Talking about luck. I'm in a dream here. Clicker didn't fall over. Awesome. Okay, so what we got? So, back that example last week. See, I think that's kind of cool cost. Here's the thing. So this week, a little roadmap. So today we'll have some sorts of lecture stuff, and Thursday we'll have probably some lecture stuff, but also do some electronic class and talk through. I don't know. I don't think it's big an issue. Well, you really weren't on campus last year. Maybe you probably were on campus last year. Where were you last year? You're in Ethernet somewhere. Okay, so they started building this power plant on campus, right? Yeah. So just for this class, what's great about this class, I love about this class, we get to talk about really interesting energy stuff on campus. So like 8 years ago when they decided to put in make a big purchase of the wind power. You all know that 25%, well, it's not 25%, but like 15% of our electricity on campus is from that wind farm up in Northwest Ohio. You know that? I go down. Because our overall electricity is not going up. That big medical center. It wasn't built when they first put we bought that. Purchased that 25%. So 25% at the time, was 6 years ago. I forget what exactly that happened. Anyways, what's fascinating about it is that the headline and the lantern when they put in was that this is going to be much cheaper than any other electricity. We've got the greatest deal in the world that they've negotiated. So what do you guys all think when you see a headline that says the best deal in the world? I think that's accurate. I mean, I don't know what you guys, I don't believe anything anyone else says. You guys should believe everything I tell you, but if anyone else tells you anything, don't believe it. Right? So I always question everything. My wife hates that aspect of me. Right? And I hate the fact that I got a kid who's exactly like me. And every time I say anything, he's always like, why? I don't do that. What are you talking about? You're stupid. So that's great. I really love the fact that he questions all that stuff. Drives me nuts. But you should always question stuff. So I was like, that can't be true. So I spent I took 8 months to get the data out of the university. How the purchase of this wind power, whether it's really going to be cheaper. And I'm sorry to say it didn't actually lower costs at the university. It actually raised costs. I don't know what these people were thinking when they negotiated that deal. So you guys are, what are you reading right now? The new map. Okay. What was happening 10 years ago?
The shale revolution?
What?
The shale revolution?
Shale revolution, right? This crazy shale revolution. So 10, I don't know, 8, 10, 12, 15 years ago, the shale thing was really just starting. And it was happening here in Ohio. And so 6 or 7 years ago, if you're negotiating a wind power deal, this is going to sound really bad, but use this brain, because honestly, what do you think is going to happen to electricity costs if you've got a massive new supply of energy coming along? Probably going to go down, right? Gonna go down, yeah, this massive increase and likely increase. Now, no one knew for sure, but everything anyone understood based on the technology and the way it happened sort of in Texas and was moving along and what was going on in Pennsylvania at the time was that there was just inordinate amounts of natural gas are going to become available. And everybody knew, and everybody knows still, that natural gas is just incredibly cleaner than coal, right? It has half the carbon dioxide per kilowatt of energy, and none of the other junk, the sulfur dioxide, the nitrogen oxides, none of it, right? So it's clean stuff, and everyone knew it was just going to overtake coal, right? This was not, you did not have to, this was not rocket science. This was just simple. You could have taken this class a bit and sort of think this through and say, wow, I think electricity price. So what did the university do when they negotiated the wind power deal? At the exact same time the shale revolution's happening, what did the university negotiate in terms of electricity prices with the wind farm? They negotiated in a 2% per year increase in prices. So they basically took whatever the commercial price was at the time, and they said, well, we'll just pay 2% more. So they just assumed the prices are going to keep going up over time. This has been the most insane thing you could ever imagine. And, so, it's just, they got that data out. I was like, well, we'll talk about this in class. We talked about it one year in class, and I was so depressed by it. Sorry, I can't really talk about it anymore. Just doesn't sound, just sounds good. But anyways, then I asked like last year, I said, can you send me the data on how much you're spending? Sure enough, I mean, they sent me the exact data. It's just accurate. They just paying 2%, a 2% increase in the price for wind power over that whole time period. Whereas natural gas prices or electricity prices on the grid have gone down, actually, it went down at that time period. So it's really a poor negotiation. So when the university, to the point of last year, what was going on last year, they're building this thing over on the other side of campus, right? This combined heat power plant. So when you see the university say it's going to be a great deal for us, what would you suspect? I would just automatically suspect it's a terrible deal, honestly. Because I got all the data from them after like 8 months of working at it. I finally got it. It was too late to use it in class last year. So we're going to talk about it on Thursday. Okay. I think I can calculate the levelized cost of that electricity. I think. So it looks like I have to do it. So I'm going to try to do that. I'll try to walk it. Okay, is that all right? Just so then you have some information. I mean, they're building the games. It's kind of irrelevant now, but at least then you can make fun of somebody and talk to them. Or maybe not. It might be the best deal. They might be correct. I don't know. Yeah.
I have a question regarding that. Have the faculty within SUNR or ADE at all like taken a stance on the power plant and its
I think
construction?
individual people do. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, individual people think it's. It just depends on who you are, where you are, what you. So yeah, I think a lot of people were upset about it. Didn't like the idea. I think some people did like the idea. So my colleague, Lena Irwin, who's the head of the sustainability, to love the idea, right? So she wrote dispatch better, right? So I think there's good. My only question is what's the economics of it? What's actually, is it actually going to be what they claim the really low cost source of electricity? That's my guess is they're probably wrong about that. It may be a better source of electricity than some other sources, but it may not be the cost. I don't know.
So why do you think that they made this wind deal if it was going to increase prices? And why
Because
did
they
they just
didn't think
do
about
some other PR thing?
Well, so Gordon Gee, the president at the time, just wanted the wind power deal, so it's going to happen no matter what. Why they negotiated a 2% increase in prices, I don't know.
Oh, so then you think they could have negotiated a decrease in prices?
I think they
even
could
with
have
this?
negotiated a stable price at the time. I think they had thought about it. I think there was more competition at the time for green electricity from the wind farm. So at the time, that Lordstown plant was still open, and Chevrolet had announced that they wanted wind from the wind farm to produce cars with zero carbon power. So there was at the time a little bit of competition for that wind power. So I think there was some competition for that. But then again, you don't have to buy a wind farm. You don't have to buy your wind power from a wind farm in Ohio. It's your OSU thing. But they weren't. People up there, I guess. I don't know. I have no idea. I'm not privy to these things.
So like, did they have any connection to the farm up there before this deal or?
No.
Oh,
In the other class, in the sustainability class, we had someone from the wind farm about 4 years ago. And I planted a kid with that question. You know, they didn't know she would taken on the deal. And he asked the question. And the guy, Dave, just smiled. He just smiled. He wouldn't answer the question. But he did smile. He had a good laugh. Anyways, so we'll look at the albatross on the other side of campus. It's fun. It's just kind of funny. We got a bunch of greenhouses, put a power plant out there. I love it. It's fantastic. I'm trying to figure out where, most people come into campus. I think they all come in along 315. It's just awesome. Pretty soon you're not even gonna be able to see Ohio State. You're just gonna have like a bunch of medical buildings and energy production. Awesome. It's probably okay. Right. Anything else? Okay, so that's what we're doing. That's a roadmap for this week. So back to the questions. So this is the third or second question, I guess. Suppose PJM RTO, Regional Transmission Organization, needs new generator capacity is going to pay you $150 per $150 per kilowatt year annually for the capacity. Which source do you build? All right, so remember, this was a combined cycle plant and a wind farm. Which one are you going to build? Which capacity? Yep.
The combined cycle.
Okay, why?
Number one, I did the math, I think correctly, and it's cheaper, but also because, they said they really badly need new generating capacity and a combined cycle and give new capacity like at any point and it comes online very quickly, so they can have that new capacity instantly.
Yeah, so capacity, remember the definition of capacity, right? That's really important to keep in mind. So what is capacity in electricity? It's available at the moment, right? That's basically the definition of capacity. So electricity that's available when you need it. Okay, so wind power is not available necessarily at all moments, right? If your demand is spiking upward because of a really high, for the last couple of days, we've had really high demand, right? As a result of high temperatures, if people are using electricity for cooling purposes, well, it's not necessarily true that you could actually just ratchet up wind power, right? Because wind power can only be available when the wind is blowing, right? But this stuff can be turned on at a moment's notice, right? And as Bruce alluded, natural gas plants have a really nice feature that they can be turned on almost at a moment's notice, right? You don't need like 3 days to prepare it. Start pointing out with a coal-fired power plant, they need several days to sort of get them ginned up. With a natural gas plant, it's really almost as easy as just flipping the switch. Okay, so that's kind of the definition of capacity. You flip the switch and it'll come on.
so it's actually just the physical capacity to
So
turn it
it's
on, or
not-
is it the economic piece? Like if you poured a ton of money, could you do the coal plant immediately, or does it actually logistically take a couple days?
Well, that's a good question. I have to go, we have to talk to Bruce about that. I have a feeling that there's some issues associated with heating. But I don't know. Yeah, it might be that you can get it much more quickly up to speed at a higher cost. So that's a good question.
Well, like when they calculate capacity, it's just kind of like the average term.
The thing about the coal is what they're doing with coal is they aren't just throwing in big chunks of coal, they're throwing in pulverized coal. And you're mixing it with other things in many cases. So in terms of the nitrogen oxide controls that they use, they spray the coal with certain chemicals in order to reduce the amount of nitrogen oxide emissions. They also mix in some wood and stuff like that in order to reduce the nitrogen oxide emissions. So they're doing all this, they're pulverizing it, creating kind of something besides that's a little value added rather than just coal chunks of coal. I think that's the stuff that takes the extra effort, I think. It's not so much the burning and generation of electricity. What's nice about natural gas is that, natural gas just starts flowing. You flip the switch and the natural gas starts flowing and light it up and it goes just like you're, in the backyard when you put on your grill or something. I think, but that's a Bruce question. Yeah. Okay, you decide to build a combined cycle plant, now you can bid the plant into the hourly or daily PJM market. What's the minimum price you should bid? Okay, so you have this thing, what's the minimum price you should bid this combined cycle plant? Yep,
Should be $24 per megawatt hour, because the variable costs for 3 and then the fuel costs for 21, so if you get both of those into account.
okay, so $24
Yeah.
variable cost, total variable cost. Yep. Everybody agree with that? What do you call that? Are you like a business major?
No.
No. That's correct, by the way. Good job. So what is that? So variable cost, so you bid in the variable cost. Why would you only bid in the variable cost? So it says that the levelized cost is what? It's $48, right? Is that the total levelized cost? Why would you bid in the 48?
Well, it's like you already have the plant anyway, and we're looking at the short term rather than the long term. So like the building of like the plant and the maintenance costs and like the fixed costs, that's like a sub cost. So we don't pay attention to that in the short run.
Yeah, essentially. So it is a sunk cost. That's not the only reason you don't account for it, but the issue is you have to pay that fixed cost no matter what. So if the plant is operating or the plant is not operating, you're still paying the fixed cost portion, right? So no matter what, you're gonna be paying that fixed cost, which is, what was it? $1,400 per kilowatt, or $140 per kilowatt year, plus the fixed O&M, which was $28 per kilowatt year, right? You're still paying those, no matter what. Even if you're not producing any kilowatts or megawatts or whatever, right? So it's a cost to you. However, you're not paying the variable cost, you're not using fuel, and you're not paying maybe whatever those variable O&M costs are, right? You're not paying those if you're not operating the plant. So in principle, all you have to do to start paying off a little bit of that fixed cost, right, is to get your variable cost covered, and maybe just a cent more or something like that, right? Just a little bit more. Right, so in principle, you would just bid in that variable cost, maybe $24.01 or something like that. Try to just get a little bit more. Right? Does that make sense? Okay, so this is kind of the shutdown condition. And if you're in a business major, you'll hear this in some accounting class, maybe, or maybe your intro to business class. The shutdown condition for most companies is that as soon as the price falls below your variable cost, you're going to shut the plant down. Conversely, if you've already got the plant shut down and you're waiting for the prices to rise, so you just need to rise above your variable cost in order to open the plant back up, right? And specifically because you've got to cover those variable costs, but you're paying the fixed costs. It turns out they are sunk costs. That's correct. They're already paid for, but that's not the only reason. Okay, so that's really important to remember that, right? It's definitely on homework. So the historical price of natural gas is average $4.67 per MMBTU. Was the question still, is it $3 per MMBTU or is it $4 per MMBTU? What was the question? $4. Sorry, I have my answer sheet from the year before, it was $3. The gas prices really went up over the last year. I didn't remember if I actually changed it on the question. So what do you think? Is the $4 per MMBTU a good assumption to make for the price of fuel of planning a major plant like a combined cycle plant? What do you think's going to happen? Who's gonna go out there on the limb and tell me what's gonna happen to the price of natural gas? Come on. Don't be OSU. Be better than OSU. They going up or they going down? Yeah. What do you think?
I mean, just based on the last 15 years, looks like they're going down.
Do you think it's a temporary increase?
Yeah.
Yeah? Why? Use justification besides just the trend. Because you know the past is no predictor of the future. You've read all this. You see those statements, haven't you?
Yeah. I would just say that, like, they're not really slowing down in terms of natural gas production, and they just keep getting more, like, they keep finding more. It's not like it's gonna be going away anytime soon.
Biden's president, though. I thought he thinks all that stuff in the ground.
I guess maybe that's something I wasn't thinking about, so that could definitely affect it and maybe go up.
Okay, so politics kind of plays into it a little bit.
Yeah.
What else might play into it? The price of natural gas. You read the new map.
Sources.
Other sources of natural gas.
Or like other sources of energy.
Okay. So how would that affect it? How would that affect it? That's good.
It-
Okay.
Like renewable sources like solar and wind, they become more efficient on technology improves. It'll become cheaper to produce, so those prices will go down. It'll get the natural gas down.
Okay, so a demand factor for natural gas is electricity, right? So if there's another source of electricity that comes along that's cheaper, i.e. solar power, right? That could keep demand in check for electricity from natural gas, right? Yeah, and Ohio has got on the book, in front of the Ohio Power Siting Board right now. Maybe we already talked about that, something like up to 10% of current electricity in Ohio. If all those projects go forward, up to 10% of the electricity in Ohio could be produced with solar within 5 years. Like, that would be, could be a big effect on it, right? Could be, and then again, you're still got what, 15% or 19% of your electricity is produced with coal, so maybe that just displaces the coal, I don't know. Probably diminish demand a little bit, and then go off for natural gas, good, okay, yeah.
Do you think like the post-COVID economic activity has already peaked and is now going to negatively impact demand, or is it just going to keep rising as like
I don't know what
the
you
United States
think.
growth? But
That's a good explanation
Ah.
factor, though, you can throw that in there.
I would say, I mean, like, you're the expert, but I would say it's kind of gonna just like even out, probably like, it's probably not gonna grow at quite as fast as it has been for the past couple of months, like the prices, as like demand levels out, but it's still gonna be increasing. Especially considering that we're phasing out coal, like, Biden can just not use any of the natural gas and just switch all the coal to renewables immediately. I don't know, you can't, but,
Yeah.
I don't think so.
Okay, so, yeah, so the demand side in terms of overall just sort of recessionary and sort of the economic cycle, right? The business cycle, I guess is probably the best word for it. So the business cycle could have an impact on it, right? So you might sort of argue that the business cycle seems to be at a peak and it's kind of coming off the peak now and probably heading down for a little while. Usually these business sort of ups and downs are, I think of 4 to 8 years on those, right? It seems to kind of be a norm, maybe. I don't know. It's a good question. We've had this weird pandemic thing, which is really throwing things out of balance. So it's kind of weird, yeah. That's good. I'm no more of an expert than you. It's a good explanation, though. Yeah.
Global relationships.
What was that?
Global relationships.
Okay, in what way?
I guess it depends on like how imports and exports go from the US. So like if some countries put limits on imports from the US or something, then the gas prices would probably go down here because it'd be more available. Or if like other countries have a higher demand for natural gas and we're still exporting to them, the natural gas prices would go here.
Okay. So one of the big things that gets talked about, and there's a lot of, so environmentalists have been dig into this, and the question of whether we should export natural gas, right? And I don't think the natural gas export terminal has been built in Newport News, Virginia. So we have all this pipeline infrastructure in the US and we can ship gas to lots of places, but one thing that has happened is gas in the southern US, because they have an export terminal in Louisiana. There was a story about that, I think, in the map, right? That there's an export terminal there, right? And so they can export natural gas pretty much anywhere. So it is true that what happens with international relations and who we can export is a pretty competitive global market for that. So yeah, that's gonna have a big impact. Yep.
What do you think the impact of like compressed natural gas and liquefied natural gas as a fuel type for cars? Like how is that going to impact, or is it just not really going to pick up, do you think?
Yeah, it's interesting. Those technologies are out there, compressed natural gas and then liquefied, basically LPG for trucks and things like that. I don't see it being used for cars because it's a little more dangerous technology. With the compressed natural gas for cars, there's a couple cars on the market. They just don't seem to be as competitive as electricity is at the moment, batteries. So, and it still is a source of emissions, right? It's a lower source of emissions than batteries, but it's still a source of emissions. So I feel like this is kind of I think there's a lot of enthusiasm for CNG cars, buses and stuff like that, but I think that's kind of diminishing. However, the LPG for transportation of trucks, or LNG, I should say, the trucks is, I think that still has potential. There's a terminal here in Ohio, there's a couple of east side of town, west side of town. They're further west than 70. So there are lots of, not lots, there are trucks that are using this, and it's much more efficient than diesel. So that has potential, I think, in the truck transportation. Yeah, so all these things would play into whether, so all those things would be fair game. The key is when you're writing an answer for that on the homework or something like that, it's just to make economic sense. It doesn't have to be correct necessarily, right? What has to be correct is that your logic is correct. I mean, how could I ever say, if you think exports are important, right? You say exports are going to increase, so the demand for natural gas is going to increase, right? Well, that's correct. So I can never really evaluate whether or not demand for exports is going to increase, but I do know that if demand goes up, then the price is going to go up, right? Okay. Okay. So that's that one. Yeah, whatever. Okay, so we were talking about peak oil. I'm sorry about this. I know we're kind of jumping back and forth. What we have to do now is kind of go back. Well, that's stupid. Oh, that's all I had to do was move that thing out of the way. Okay. Good enough. So we just need to finish up a little bit on the demand side. Then we're talking about the supply side, okay? And then we're going to really just focus on two other sources of energy. Then we're talking about renewables, basically, and climate change for the rest of the year. So on the demand side, we're talking about peak oil. And we're talking about demand, peak oil demand. And I don't know, this picture to me represents kind of peak oil demand in a sense. The question is the way we're going to get peak oil demand is if, there's two different trends, right? There's what's going on in developing countries and what's going on in developed countries. So this is a picture that shows the demand for oil, the consumption of oil in OECD countries. So Organization of Economic Cooperation for Economic Cooperation Development. So it's basically rich countries in that category, OECD countries. So US, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Chile's in there. Mexico actually, I don't think they're probably OECD.
Yeah,
Is there income that high? Really?
they're like the number 12 GDP in the world.
I'm gonna look that up.
I just looked it up yesterday.
I don't trust anyone, especially you. Just kidding. Okay, like Canada. Sure you're not thinking of Canada?
Oh, Mexico.
It's the other side. Just kidding. Okay. Mexico. Right. And then the rest of the world is kind of developing, mostly developing countries. All right. So what's going on in developing countries, obviously, is increased demand is leading people to, well, increased income is leading people to sort of purchase automobiles almost for the first time, right? To access the money, they're able to purchase an automobile. And most of those automobiles at the moment are gas guzzling automobiles that are usually going to be leftovers from a place like the US or something like that. Used cars from richer countries that move to those places, right? And because they're going to be cheaper for people to purchase rather than brand new cars. So they're going to get relatively lower gas mileage than the gas mileage that we would get. So, you know, what's really going to drive people on the demand side is going to be whether or not, you know, we're able to sort of slow down consumption of oil quickly enough to sort of offset what looks to be a continuing increase in the developing world. Right? So it has been happening. You know, we do get better and better fuel efficiency each year, and that helps drive down our consumption a bit. We are seeing, you know, an increasing use and purchase of electric cars, which does drive down the consumption of oil. We do see increased transportation options, especially as cities grow bigger and bigger, right? So places where there's enough density of development, then, you know, transportation options have just gotten better. We'll have more and more options to get around, and that reduces our consumption of oil. So, you know, the question is from people outside on the demand side is how quickly can we sort of de-emphasize the use of oil in the OECD countries, given that this trend is likely to continue for quite some time, right? Okay, so okay, does higher economic and population growth always lead to more energy consumption? There is a lot of confusion on this issue. I don't know that we'll answer it satisfyingly for you, but hopefully provide you some tools to think about this issue, and that's really what I'm hoping to do. So, you know, higher population and income definitely increase demand for energy, right? Especially when those less wealthy people become richer, and we have a growing middle class, right? But there's lots of evidence that at the higher income levels, that more income leads to different energy consumption choices. And this happens in lots of ways. So in places like the US, we have different energy consumption choices, partly because of what we as individual consumers choose, right? We choose typically better cars that get better gas mileage, right? We typically, when we buy new appliances, you know, I have to admit, we upgraded the furnace and air conditioner, and, you know, I kind of went with the top of the line, most efficient stuff, and it was really expensive, but it's been pretty nice actually, right? But a lot of people do that, not everybody, but a lot of people do that if they've got the money to do that. Okay, so we do see that, but we also see what? We also see that we are willing to more broadly accept our government requiring everybody to make some minimal level of choice, right? So while I was able to sort of choose this top of the line sort of air conditioning and heating unit, right? By law, there's a minimum acceptable level that anybody could choose. It's cheaper than what I purchased, but nonetheless, there's a minimal level, right? And we're willing to accept our government sort of forcing companies to sort of meet those minimum levels. And if I happen to be in the Western US or the Southwestern US in particular, the Southern US in particular, the standards for air conditioning are even higher, right? So, you know, we do require that. And we do, you know, as we get to higher levels of income, there's evidence that people are willing to support their government in sort of requiring an effort to try to avoid free riders, right? To try to minimize the effect of free riders on the system. So that also leads to different kinds of energy consumption choices just in aggregate, right? And of course, the other thing, and this is the big story sort of in China, it's a big story historically in the US, is that economic growth itself, as income levels rise, tends to shift from sort of heavier manufacturing, which is really energy intensive, towards, financial or services sectors, which are a lot less energy intensive. So when we look at the US, we have great examples of that in the US. So we have a place like Ohio, which was part of the industrial rust belt of the US, right? And the energy source that really drove that was coal for over 100 years, for 120, 130 years, right? California developed in an entirely different way, right? Significantly less industrial, significantly more involved in services and the financial sector, and has a completely different energy sort of base than we have for sure, right? So if you're more financially oriented, more service oriented, then having something like plenty of hydropower, lots of wind power, and lots of, I guess, solar power as well, is just fine, right? If you're more industrial in nature, if you're building cars, if you've got steel factories and stuff like that, then probably, unless you're Iceland, where you have massive amounts of geothermal, then you're probably going to have access to a source of energy like coal, right? However, as a place like Ohio shifts from heavy manufacturing, from steel production, automobile production, et cetera, towards more of a services-oriented economy, which we are doing, it's probably okay to start shifting towards more renewable sources. Probably won't have as much of a negative impact on your economic growth. Okay, so, and this is the same thing, it's the same issues as you can see happening in China, that they went through a long period of economic growth driven by heavy industry, really driven by use of coal because it's an easy to use, easy to convert technology, and there's plenty of it. Now moving to trying to move towards more of a service-oriented economy and starting to put more effort into renewable energy, right? Yep.
I was curious if you could define what highest income level means.
Typically at the OECD level, which would be probably more than sort of $17,000 to $20,000 per person per year. So, our annual income, average income in the US is 59,000. I think I just saw for 2019, 2020 is probably about the same. I think that if Mexico's part of the OECD, their average income is probably somewhere around 17,000 or 18,000, I imagine. So that'd be kind of the minimum for that higher level. Someone have something over here? Okay. Okay, a formula you might want to use, I'm not going to require you to use it, I'll just put it up there for your information. Okay. I don't know, you may want to use it someday. You may not, I don't care. But this is just a simple way to put together a couple of concepts we talked about. So if you wanted to figure out the demand growth for anything, this can work for energy or anything else. You can start to make projections for yourself about what demand growth would look like with just a couple of pieces of information. First off, you need some kind of a projection of population growth, right? Because actual additional people are going to consume more stuff. Right? So if we're trying to figure out what the growth in demand for energy would be, I would want to know how many more people are going to be around a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, right? That would be an important part of any kind of a future projection. So the population growth rate is an important thing. A second thing is income, because income matters for what? Income matters for what we consume, right? Higher income people are going to consume different things than lower income people. And just an increase in income is likely to cause an increase in my consumption of just about anything, right? So those two things I want to make a projection for if I'm trying to project the demand growth for, I don't know, any kind of energy. This is just for energy in general, right? For the world. This is what we're trying to do. How much energy will the world need in 2060? Okay, so I want to get the population growth for the world, income growth rate, and I want to translate the income growth rate into what it means for the demand of energy. I'm going to use the income elasticity. So we talked about income elasticity, which is the percentage change in consumption over the percentage change in income. Now remember, I'm not going to force you to use this calculation. Just presenting it to you for your information. But if I take the percentage change in income, and multiply it by that income elasticity, it tells me how much of that income increase translates into a demand increase for that good, right? And income elasticity is going to be something an economist is going to have to tell you, oh, the income elasticity for energy is X. Oh, the income elasticity for solar energy is Y, right? So they're going to estimate that amount, that number, and tell it to you, just the same way they would estimate the price elasticity for you, right? And then you can use it in a projection, right? So in this case, we're going to say that, you know, population is going to increase and the world's going to increase to 10.2 billion people. Income increases from around 11,000 per capita today to about 36,000. This is on average for the world, right? And I'm just going to make the assumption that the income elasticity is 0.5. All right, that's given a population, growth rate increase of 0.72% per year, with that median unit projection and income rise of 3% per year. So I can take the 0.72, the percentage increase in population, plus 3%, which is the income increase, times the 0.5. Add those two things together and get a 2.2% per year increase in demand. You can translate population and income into how much extra demand there would be for whatever good it is you're looking at, right? So it could be a useful thing. I mean, if you're at a company and you're trying to figure out, okay, well, how much is the demand going to go for stuff I'm producing, this could be a useful thing to be able to do, right? So if I have that 2.2% increase and I just use this compounding formula, I can figure out that I'm going to need 138%. 40 years. Yay! Isn't that awesome? 40%, 138% more energy. Geez, that's a lot, isn't it? Oh, gosh. We get tired, I have to walk back and forth. So you could do this across different scenarios and get a sense for just how much potentially extra energy could be consumed, right? As a result of income and population growth. So on a medium scenario, maybe 140% or so increase. High scenario, maybe 260. That's a big increase. Whew. If we get that much more population plus high income growth, that'd be kind of like, wow. What happened in China over the last couple of decades gets replicated first in India, then in Africa. That would be kind of this scenario. Like if we have that scenario, then look out, we're gonna need a lot more energy. On the other hand, we just have a moderate one where the other countries aren't able to replicate what China was able to do. And we end up with, you know, not so much more, just a little bit more than a doubling of electricity or energy consumption, right? Okay, so those are useful. So what else affects energy demand? Population, income, what else? Yep.
Maybe like new technologies that haven't been invented yet, like they might use more energy than stuff we use right now.
Okay, so technology change, right? So technology, you're sort of saying that it should increase the demand for energy, right? Why does that happen? Why does new technology increase the demand for energy? Yep.
Is it because it increases efficiency, which makes prices go down, which makes people consume more?
Okay, so there's something called a rebound effect, which you'll sometimes hear as a rebound effect. So if you get a big increase in improvement in efficiency, right? If the things you use that use energy suddenly can produce the same amount of output with less energy, then that decreases the demand for energy. That drives prices down for energy and actually causes people to potentially consume a little bit more, right? So that's called a rebound effect. All right, that could happen. Yeah.
Technology also is increasing complexity, which means like you need more complex inputs, and also like, dealing with waste takes more energy as well.
What was the second part of that?
Dealing with like technological waste takes more energy to like recycle and like disassemble things, take more energy.
Wait, that sounds like you actually think we're actually going to recycle stuff.
Well, some components, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So sometimes just production, improved technologies. Yeah. Some of them maybe get more complicated, right? You know, nothing's more complicated really than an automobile or an airplane or something like that, right? And then, but getting rid of those things in the future could actually take a lot of energy to get rid of them. Okay, I could buy that as sort of driving up some of the demand for energy. What else? Yeah,
Just with technology specifically, I would say like research and development might also increase, because until you get to a point where you're creating efficiency, you just be wasting it in the process.
can you repeat that a little louder though?
Yeah, sorry. Like research and development, in terms of like until you get to the point where technology is actually efficient, it's still also just wasting energy.
Okay, so research and development itself, that enterprise actually uses energy, right?
So does that not factor into the technology?
It could. It could. So you would say that would increase the demand for energy overall? Okay, all right, yep.
Would a decrease in costs or price for the inputs to energy also like cause for like demand globally to grow? Like say like the price of like oil or gas like decreases, that would mean that demand would be higher.
The quantity of them consumed could be higher. So that's a whole other thing. And that's what we've actually experienced the most of in the last decade, right? Is that we had the shale revolution, right? Which was an improvement in technology for extracting oil and natural gas from the ground, which dramatically drove down the price for oil and natural gas, right? And because we drove down the price, we shifted out the consumption, we increased consumption. Yeah. Yeah, so technologies and end products like automobiles, you know, maybe they would reduce consumption of gasoline. They probably should slow down the demand for gasoline, right? If we have much improved fuel efficiency, should slow down the demand for gasoline, right? On the other hand, if we have much improved technology for extracting the crap from the ground in the first place, that could drive up the supply, which drives down the price, which increases the quantity consumed, right? Yeah, so some technology, so it really kind of depends on which technology we're talking about, right? So some technologies could drive down the demand for energy. Some of them could drive up the demand for energy, right? And we have to really be clear about which ones we're talking about. Yep.
I'd say political conditions, because if you're having, you know, really unstable political conditions, maybe your population is like thrown into poverty and so demand will go down, or like the opposite can happen with better conditions and like stable governments and less corruption.
Yeah, so political stability definitely affects the demand for energy for sure, right? And we have, I don't want to say great examples. We have examples in, you know, the Western Hemisphere. You know, for instance, in Venezuela, right, demand for energy has been driven down dramatically by poor governance. I think most people would agree with that. Has been poor governance, but it's also really wrecked their oil industry. They have one of the biggest proved reserves of oil, but they're unable to extract most of them because nobody will invest in Venezuela because no one really trusts the government there, right? And so they don't have access to the newest technologies, actually, right? To some extent, the same thing is happening in Mexico. You can read a little bit about that in the new map, right? In that first sections, the sections we're supposed to read so far in the new map, which is that, wow, what happened in Mexico in the last, you know, couple of decades is, in the last 5 decades really, is because they have a government-owned oil company which monopolizes the oil sector. The government's been really inefficient, and they just haven't invested in new technologies. And they haven't gotten other countries to invest in new technologies either. So their oil production and natural gas production have not been increasing. They seem to have the supplies available, but they're not actually investing in the technologies to extract those supplies. So as a result, they're actually importing massive amounts of natural gas from the US, right? Through pipelines, even though they have a huge supply of their own, which maybe is good for them in the long run. I don't know if they'll use that in the future, but in any event, so that's political stability can affect demand for sure, right? Or I should say quantity for sure. Okay, good. So on technology, you know, it's really important to keep track. Well, let me try to do that. You have to be really careful and keep track of what you're thinking about with technology change. when you think about whether or not it has a positive or negative effect on energy demand. So there's been lots of technologies over time that have really just shifted demand outward, right? So refrigerators, freezers, microwaves, cars, motorized lawnmowers, all this stuff just increases demand for energy consumption, right? Pretty much all the things that we think of as our household goods and services that we consume all the time. Okay. Adoption of replacement technology typically should lead to efficiency improvements, but could have these rebound effects. I forget who said that in the back, right? But it could lead to rebound effects. So, and we've seen this in the US. So there's lots of evidence that when the Priuses were first sort of imported into the US and sold to consumers, that especially in California, that we did see that people who bought Priuses actually drove more miles than they drove before they had the Priuses, right? So there's a number of different studies that have been done to show that because they got the gain of better fuel efficiency, in fact, big increases in fuel efficiency relative to the automobiles they had before, they actually drove more. And the internet connection's unstable. I guess it's stable now. And we can also see that countries moving lots of people from lower and middle income have historically done so with increase in heavy industry, which is energy intensive, right? As that income increases, so not only is there a direct effect of potentially income on technology and then technology on income, but we can see as people move up the income stream, they start to choose different kinds of energy as well, right? So technology change has, I mean, you got to keep track of the different influences it could have. This is just to point out that, you know, energy consumption, all these good things just simply went up, right? It's got all these new technologies. Is it ever going to slow down with new technologies, energy consumption? What do you think? Think it'll slow down?
Probably not.
Probably not. So the average household right now consumes in the US or in Ohio about 900 kilowatt hours per month on average over the year. Do you think like a decade from now or 2 decades from now, we're going to consume less or more?
I think there's gonna be an increase of people who opt to use very little technology and really try to be very like mindful about like the energy they're putting into their household. Yeah, I also think there's gonna be people who are more extreme, that there's gonna be a higher amount of people using a lot more electricity. So I feel like it's gonna be more of like a net positive still, rather than a setback from the people that do opt out to use less electricity.
Yeah. I'm not so optimistic that many people are going to consume less, though. Not as optimistic as you are. I mean, my guess is we're just all going to have bigger houses. We're going to consume more, and more stuff is going to be electrical. So right now, well, most of us in Central Ohio use natural gas for heating our homes. You know, within a couple of decades, probably within a decade, we're all just going to use electricity for that, which is going to increase the amount of energy we consume, actually. Yep.
I mean, like, at some point, it has to level out with, like, maybe in America, there's enough land for this, but like, in worldwide, like, there's not enough land for people to have progressively larger houses, and I don't know, like, on some, it's like on some level, your consumption is gonna level out just because one person can't produce, can't use that much stuff. So, like, this is for the US, right? Like, population of the US, percentage of the US population with this technology.
Yeah, this is
Yeah.
just the US, yeah.
So like, it's already pretty high. So it's like, unless for some reason our washing machines get like insanely more energy intensive, like, I don't know. I know that I don't want a big house, but that's just me. Like, I would actually.
Yeah,
not have a
but
big
what's
house.
the next machine we're going to need is that uses a lot of energy. It's going to be our cell phone washing machines. I mean, it's literally, we're all going to have a machine where we throw our cell phones in, it'll be rejuvenated overnight. All cleaned up. It just takes some energy. I'm just thinking out of the box here. I mean, come on, this is the stuff we know about. What's the stuff we don't know about? Like the next invention that's gonna take, that's gonna, that we're all gonna have to have in our houses. I don't know. Yeah.
Is it possible that, like, better technology to create more energy efficient, like washing machines, radios, is enough to offset like the growing amount of demand for it?
That's what we're gonna have to hope for, actually, right? Is that somehow we're gonna have better, efficient, more efficient things, right, that offset the increase in the new things that we don't even know about that are gonna consume electricity or energy of some sort, right? Yeah.
Is it all that bad if we like, continue to increase our energy demand? As long as like we find ways to make that energy cleaner? Like I know it's kind of a version of that.
So the awesome thing is that even as we seem to have a preference, a little bit of a modest preference for less energy consumption, we also do have a preference for cleaner energy as our income goes up. Yeah. So we would definitely hope for that, right? That as we move towards things that consume more energy, we figure out a way to take our energy sector and make it hundreds of times cleaner, right? Yeah, for sure. Okay, just flipping through these really quick. All good? You guys got all that stuff. This is the summary. So you guys all knew all that. So you didn't have to look at those slides, honestly. Those were just repeats. So in summary, population, absolutely increases in population are going to increase demand for stuff, right? Increase demand for energy. Income rising increases the demand for energy, but it also increases the demand for, cleaner energy. I think just as you were saying. So factors that can slow energy demand, technology change, large observed increases in economic output per unit. This is happening out there, right? And that can continue to happen. We didn't talk so much about migration, but urbanization definitely slows the demand for energy. So we can talk a little bit about it. The cities actually are substantially more energy conserving than large rural areas. And the overall trend globally is towards urbanization. There is this environmental Kuznets curve for energy consumption, and there's definitely an environmental Kuznets curve for the type of energy consumed. You guys, let's go back to that picture. You guys all saw that, right? You all get that? Everyone's seen this in other classes, that as GDP per capita rises, as income rises, if you're a low income country, your environmental quality diminishes and at some point flips over. That seems to take place both for total energy consumption as well as for the type of energy we want to consume. That is for the cleanliness of the energy. As we get richer, we want greener, right? As we get richer, we seem to want a little less energy per person. And all those other figures in there were just sort of supporting that, right? Data supporting that. And you can find that data for yourself if you go into the BP data, all right? Okay, isn't that exciting? God, man, I mean, this is so danged exciting. I'm gonna flip over to supply because this is even more exciting. What's more exciting than demand and supply? Thank you. You guys ever notice how terrible Zoom is at translating, closed captioning? It's better than YouTube?
Way better.
Really? Oh, YouTube is much better.
No way.
Really?
Yeah. Trust me.
I don't know, man. I've looked at both of them. I don't know. It's interesting. I come to different
I would
conclusions.
say like every other sentence, at least for me, is like something completely like not what it means.
I second that. People have to like put in their own methods or else it's just like garbage. And I guess it's just like, they just haven't found it necessary to put in the time to fix that, or there's other voice recognition things that are so much better, like Google.
Okay. Maybe it's just the person speaking. Unintelligible. I've been accused of that from time to time. So what we're gonna do on supply is understand what the supply function is. Same thing with the demand side. This is more exciting though, because this is where it's at with the energy sector. This is what it's all about in the energy sector, right? The demand side is interesting, but the supply side is what we actually all care about, okay? And what you guys, I think, care about probably is renewable energy. That's a supply side thing, I think. Okay, so US oil production and prices. So here's just some fascinating things that's going on the supply side and the demand side. We've had all these shocks in the energy sector, especially in the oil sector. And the question is, what have they been driven by? Demand shocks or supply shocks? It's fascinating because we've had both examples in the oil sector. So back here in the old days, the 70s and the 80s, we had a big run up in prices for oil. That was a supply shock. Okay. It was a supply shock that actually wasn't even a supply shock. So what happened back then was first in 1973. Anyone know what happened in 1973? Yep.
Hostage?
What was that?
The hostage crisis?
79. That was the second one. That was this one. All right. That was that one. This one was something that's Arab-Israeli war was first. It was in 73. And then there was an oil embargo. So the Arab countries basically embargoed the US and its allies. And so we're not going to ship oil to any of those countries. So prices sort of spiked up pretty dramatically at that time, right? So there was never actually a reduction in oil production globally. However, as a result of the oil embargo, there was a big increase in prices, and that drove down consumption, and especially in the US, right, where our consumption went down. We were at the time the world's biggest oil producer, and our oil production went down. It's not surprising, right, since prices went up. There was also another thing that was happening at the time that caused prices to kind of start to go up as well. What was that? We'll talk about that as well in terms of supply. It's called peak oil from the supply side. All right. So there was concern that we actually were running out of oil globally. All right. We think today is a dismal time. That was actually a really dismal time. All right. If you guys lived through the 70s, which I did, it was dismal. It was terrible. There was nothing worse than the 70s. Have you seen the clothes people wore? I mean, seriously, that was just emblematic of how awful it was. All right. And so people thought, wow, we peaked out in oil production. It was just on a downward spiral after that, right? So there were lots of factors kind of on the supply side that were driving up prices in that time. One was this concept of peak oil, that there was literally the theory that still exists today that we're going to run out of this stuff. And that, in fact, the evidence was that we were on track to run out of this stuff. And so that was driving prices up. Then there was the fact that people who had some of this stuff, we didn't quite know how much yet, but they had some of it. We knew they had a lot of it, but maybe not as much as we had originally. But they were actually embargoing this and not shipping it to us, right? So that was driving up prices. And then in 1979, when the Iranian crisis happened, that drove up prices as well. Pretty significant. Of course, they fell down pretty quickly, right? Now, this increase in prices was different. It was driven by a different phenomenon. That was driven by what? Anyone know what that price increase was driven by? That's what we just talked about, demand side phenomenon. So that was China, right? So this is largely driven by massive increase in global consumption of stuff as income in China increased dramatically, right? Starting in the early 2000s. And that really drove prices up pretty dramatically. Okay, so we can see where supply side things kind of had an influence on prices and markets pretty dramatically. First, there's potentially a reduction in supply. And then in combination with OPEC acting monopolistically and saying we're going to embargo oil from that particular place, right? And it drove up prices. And then here, sort of demand went up. And what did the demand increase do? It drove prices up. And what did those prices do? Those higher prices, what they spurred investment in this new technology called what? Fracking, right? Hydraulic fracturing. And so hydraulic fracturing, if you read that book, wasn't really new. right? All that was new at this point in time was that prices were high enough to allow the technology to get started, right? So prices shot up, and with these higher prices, people who otherwise probably wouldn't have taken the gamble at, combining this sort of horizontal drilling with better mapping, with bombs in the ground, right? They probably wouldn't have tried those things out. Or maybe they would have waited till later to try them out, but they tried them out because hell, prices were high, and they could make money trying them out anyways, right? And if it worked, awesome. And there's a story of that one guy who his name was, but literally it was natural gas in Texas. And, he literally had these contracts to deliver massive amounts of natural gas. And he had no natural gas, right? What was his name? Really rich dude. It's in the book. Anyone remember his name? Well, he's dead now, but he was a real rich dude at the time. I guess his kids are rich. Yeah, anyways, he was at the end of his rope. If he didn't find natural gas, if that hydraulic fracturing didn't work out for him, he would have been out billions of dollars. Sorry for him, but he would have been out. Okay, anyways, so supply side phenomenon, got to get a sense of it. Critically important. Yay, whatever. What is supply? Supply is the marginal cost of production. That's just the definition. Supply function, you guys can function. Marginal cost, additional cost of producing energy. And this is actually useful stuff. We start talking about energy, as you'll see in a second. Supply is the amount of goods, say oil, that we produce at a good price. Okay, oh, everyone got that? Love this. Awesome. Did that switch? It did, didn't it? Wow. Push a button and it switches. What will they come up with next? If the price rises, what's going to happen? It's going to induce existing producers to produce more, new producers enter the market, newer, more expensive technologies to be deployed. All this affects the energy markets. This is really important, actually. I'm going to try to explain to you why, but it's really important. Okay. So what's happening when those prices are changing is you're just inducing different behaviors out of people, right? And the supply thing is just sort of tracing what those different behaviors are. Your job, if you're an analyst, is to try to predict what those behaviors are going to be, right? You got to have your little, whatever goggles you're going to have on to try to figure out what this thing looks like for different kinds of technologies, so you can start to make sort of what ifs that, well, if prices go up, those people over there are going to do this, right? Sort of starting to think strategically about how other people are going to respond to the same kinds of market transactions you're going to be observing. Well, here you go. Who's making money in the oil market? 2016, this was the price was $70 a barrel. What's the price of oil today? $70 a barrel. 72. Cool. 4 years later, it's the same price. Awesome. Okay. So who's making money in the oil market? Everybody turns out to make money, right? All of these countries out there have these sort of marginal costs of oil production, which are really low, and prices are really high. How's the price set? The price is set based on what? What was that? Well, that's correct. But it's based on what? So this is the margin. It's based on that marginal unit, right? So this is kind of awesome. So this is 72 for today, right? I don't know what the number is today. But every one of these countries has a lower, this is Saudi Arabia, their costs, right? US is with this US. US shales like 20 some dollars, right? So they're making a ton of money. So companies that are in the oil sector are making a ton of money because the price is determined by that marginal units at last year. Right? Somebody out there has an oil well that costs $72 a barrel, and that's the one that set the price, right? It's the same thing with electricity. Remember that electricity dispatch curve, right? It's that last unit of electricity that's dispatched that basically sets the price, right? Whatever the marginal cost of production of that is, that's what sets the price. So this is probably, hell, I don't know, probably Turkmenistan or something like that. I have no idea. Actually, it's probably in Africa. They don't seem to be out there. Oh, Nigeria is there. They got pretty low price, low cost. Anyway, wherever it is, right? It's hard to get to, it's expensive, maybe it's expensive, right? So that's kind of saying, but everybody else is making a ton of money. Obviously, prices go down, right? Because they got down to $40 a barrel in the pandemic, and that was because demand shifted in, right? And fewer people were making money. But you know, right now everybody's making money in oil, $72 a barrel. So what shifts the supply function? Well, there's the technology changes we were talking about, fracking, new discoveries can shift it. It's just a huge new discovery in Guyana. It's a little small country, right? 700,000 people in Guyana. There's 2.2 million Guyanese who live in the US and Canada. 700,000 of them in Guyana. And they just found a massive supply of oil right off their coast, right? And Exxon's taking it out of the ground right now. Different shocks like we're experiencing. Just reading an article about Shell. They've got 2 massive oil platforms in the Gulf of Mexico, which haven't started back up yet. So after AEDE went through, not that they got damaged, but it just takes so long to start these things back up, right? So these kinds of things can affect the supply, right, of oil. So technology, new discoveries, shocks can shift the supply function for oil. Demand shifts will shift along the supply function. Okay. Exciting stuff. So when we think about the supply and demand side, we're going to think of short run factors, medium run factors, long run factors. The timeline you should think about for these, the short run is kind of less than a year. Right? You hear people talk about the short run in energy markets, especially oil markets. Medium run tends to be 1 to 5 years. Long run are sort of greater than 5 years. Right? Types of things that fit into these categories, short run factors, weather, hurricanes, things that affect the supply, short term, things that affect transportation, weather factors that affect transportation or extraction. Well, political instability could be both short run and long run, right? And then these other kinds of short run disruptions, people could be protesting a pipeline or whatever, right? That would be a short run or a long run. Medium run factors, interest rates, input prices, political instability. Political instability kind of fit into factors that will affect prices of the supply of oil anywhere those time periods. Yahoo! Man, I can just tell you guys are just fired up. Conventional oil production. Why am I showing this? Yeah. Okay, so this is kind of the old model, the original model up until shale fracking came along for oil production. It's what drives the peak oil theory. Why do they call something peak oil? Well, you can see a peak of oil production. So the typical oil well, the typical oil field, I should say, has a production schedule that kind of looks like this. So what happens is somebody goes in and discovers oil, and they drill a well. They start extracting some oil. Right? This happens to be a pretty big field, if it's a conventional field. So until they can get enough oil rigs in there and start extracting oil, their oil production is going to continue to rise over some time period. At some point, they're going to hit their maximum level of extraction. And after that, they're just going to be running out of oil from that oil well. Right? Or I should say from that field. You might have many oil wells on that same field. So this is kind of the history of oil extraction pretty much anywhere in the world from the conventional types of oil supplies. And the cost of output would look something like this. That is, your cost would be declining as you're moving up this curve, right? And eventually your costs are going to be rising as you're moving down. There's your extraction level from that oil field is declining. Your costs are going to be rising. Okay, So as you start to think of peak oil, you can start to get a sense for why someone would come up with the idea that we might eventually run out, right? If every oil well looks like this, eventually you're gonna run out of stuff. Now, what we discovered is in most wells, is the end isn't really the end. That is, there's always a little bit left. And how much is left really depends on your willingness to spend money to get it out, okay? So most wells can be pushed a little bit further, so even if this is what you think is available, by spending a little bit more money, you can actually increase the supply of oil in pretty much any well. And the only thing that's gonna get you to give up extraction from that oil well is if prices don't rise anymore. Okay? So if you look at this picture, what it's basically saying is that, well, you've got this big oil field, and you're kind of on the downside. If suddenly prices go up, you're gonna start to put money into new technologies that are gonna allow you to extract a little bit more oil from that well or that field that you didn't think you had before. Technology is called enhanced oil recovery, which is basically what? Enhanced oil recovery is taking carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and sticking it underground to push out more oil. How does oil get out of the ground? It gets out of the ground with pressure, right? So this is kind of a picture saying, what if we add no additional pressure of our own to that oil well? This one is saying, well, what if we add some extra pressure? We can pump a little bit more of that stuff out. Right? How do we add pressure? Well, we pump carbon dioxide down into the ground. It's called enhanced oil recovery. If you paid attention to the debate over what the U.S. is going to do for its Paris Agreement efforts, one of the big suggestions by the oil industry is that enhanced oil recovery. Basically, they want to take carbon dioxide out of the air and stuff it underground in order to get more oil out of it. Right? So it's a tried and true technology that actually does store carbon. There's some legitimacy. And if you look at the way the oil industry is now trying to characterize itself, they're actually doing what? They're actually calculating the tons of carbon dioxide per barrel of oil produced. And so each barrel of oil in every part of the world gets its own sort of carbon footprint calculation, life cycle estimate, right? And so if you could be an oil company like Exxon or something like that, that can use enhanced oil recovery, then you can actually lower the environmental effect of your oil and make it look better, right? So if you're in supply chain management, and you're trying to track through this particular product, the clothes you're wearing, computers you have, the transportation it took to get those to you as a consumer, right? That's a legitimate, emitting thing associated with the stuff you bought. If you can reduce the oil, I should say the carbon emission of each barrel of oil, then you can make those things look better, right? So, okay, so anyways, but you'll only engage in those things if the prices are going up, right? Or if you're regulated, you're forced to do it. All right, so we'll quit there. We'll start again on Thursday. We'll do a little more discussion of supply, and we've got some more in-class, another in-class exam to work through, and then we'll probably Oops, sorry. Let me grab it. I got my phone, so I can only see this.